The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly in the mathematics lecture hall at Ridgemont University, where Professor Helen Carter stood before 70 students on a cold Monday morning. She was known across campus as one of the toughest professors in the advanced mathematics department, and her classes always pushed students to their absolute limits. Today she was teaching about complex equations that dealt with space and time, which were topics that most students found incredibly difficult to understand. The room smelled like old books and coffee as students settled into their seats with notebooks open and pencils. Ready? Professor Carter turned to the massive whiteboard behind her and began writing an equation that stretched across 3 entire panels. Her chalk made sharp clicking sounds as she wrote numbers and symbols that seemed to grow more complicated with each passing second. The equation filled the board from top to bottom and left to right until it looked like some kind of mathematical monster that was ready to eat anyone who dared to approach it. When she finally stepped back and admired her work, the students stared at the board with expressions that ranged from confusion to complete terror. She turned to face the class with her arms crossed and a slight smile on her face that suggested she knew exactly how intimidating this problem appeared to everyone in the room. The equation she had written was not just some random problem from a textbook, but something that had real importance for humanity's future, in ways that most of these students could not even begin to imagine. This was mathematics that would determine whether Earth would be accepted into the greater galactic community or left behind to struggle alone in the universe. Professor Carter began her explanation by pointing to different sections of the equation and describing what each part represented in terms of physics and spatial mathematics. She talked about dimensions that existed beyond the normal 3 that humans experienced every day, and about how space could be folded and manipulated if you understood the correct mathematical principles. Her voice was confident and clear as she explained concepts that had taken her decades to fully understand, and she expected her students to follow along even though she knew most of them were already lost. In the back corner of the lecture hall sat Marcus Webb, who was taking notes at a steady pace while his eyes moved between the board and his notebook. Marcus was only 16 years old, which made him by far the youngest person in this advanced mathematics class. He had enrolled at Ridgemont University 2 years earlier, through a special program designed for students who showed exceptional abilities in mathematics and science. His test scores had been so high that the university had no choice but to accept him, even though he was still technically supposed to be in high school. Being so much younger than everyone else in his classes had taught Marcus to keep quiet and avoid drawing attention to himself whenever possible. He had learned early on that speaking up often led to skepticism and doubt from both professors and fellow students who seemed unable to believe that someone his age could truly understand the material at such an advanced level. So Marcus had developed a habit of sitting in the back and working through problems on his own while letting older students ask the questions and participate in discussions. As Professor Carter continued her lecture, Marcus found himself working through the equation in his notebook with increasing speed and confidence. The problem that she described as nearly impossible was beginning to make sense to him in ways that felt almost natural and intuitive. He could see patterns in the numbers and relationships between the variables that seemed to jump off the page and arrange themselves into a clear solution. His pencil moved faster as he worked through each step and double-checked his calculations to make sure he had not made any mistakes. Professor Carter was now telling the class about how this particular equation had stumped some of the brightest mathematical minds on Earth for the past 6 months. She mentioned her own doctoral student, Gregory Phillips, who had spent weeks trying to solve it, before finally admitting defeat and moving on to other research projects. The equation represented a test that had been given to humanity by advanced alien civilizations who wanted to see if Earth was intellectually capable of joining the Galactic Council. So far, every mathematician who had attempted to solve it had failed completely. The professor explained that Earth had made first contact with alien species 3 years ago, and the encounter had been both exciting and humbling for humanity. The aliens had been polite but firm in their assessment that Earth was far behind the rest of the galaxy in terms of scientific and mathematical development. They had given humanity 10 years to prove that the species was capable of intellectual advancement or face the possibility of being isolated from the galactic community forever. This equation was meant to be a simple benchmark test, but it had become a symbol of everything that Earth was struggling to achieve. Marcus stared down at his notebook where He had just completed what he believed was the full solution to the equation. He had approached the problem differently than what Professor Carter had described as the standard method. Instead of trying to solve each dimensional variable separately, Marcus had recognized that the dimensions were connected in a nested pattern that required simultaneous calculation. He had used techniques from fractal geometry that he had studied on his own to create a framework that allowed all the variables to be solved together rather than one at a time. The solution looked elegant and simple now that it was complete, which made Marcus even more confident that he had done it correctly. In mathematics, the most profound truths often appeared deceptively simple once you understood the underlying structure. He checked his work 3 more times, going through each step carefully and verifying every calculation. There were no errors that he could find, and the answer satisfied all the conditions that the equation required. Professor Carter was now asking if anyone in the class could even suggest where to begin with solving this problem. The room remained silent as students shifted uncomfortably in their seats and avoided making eye contact with her. She sighed deeply and shook her head as if disappointed but not surprised by the lack of response. She told the class that this was exactly why Earth was failing to meet the expectations of the galactic community and why humanity might never be accepted. As an equal partner among the stars, Marcus felt his hand beginning to move toward the air, but he stopped himself before raising it completely. Speaking up now would mean becoming the center of attention and dealing with all the doubt and skepticism that usually came when he tried to contribute in class. He had experienced it so many times before, and each time it left him feeling frustrated and invisible. But this time was different because this time he had actually solved something important and something that could potentially help all of humanity take a step forward in the universe. The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly in the mathematics lecture hall at Ridgemont University, where Professor Helen Carter stood before 70 students on a cold Monday morning. She was known across campus as one of the toughest professors in the advanced mathematics department, and her classes always pushed students to their absolute limits. Today she was teaching about complex equations that dealt with space and time, which were topics that most students found incredibly difficult to understand. The room smelled like old books and coffee as students settled into their seats with notebooks open and pencils ready. Professor Carter turned to the massive whiteboard behind her and began writing an equation that stretched across 3 entire panels. Her chalk made sharp clicking sounds as she wrote numbers and symbols that seemed to grow more complicated with each passing second. The equation filled the board from top to bottom and left to right until it looked like some kind of mathematical monster that was ready to eat anyone who dared to approach it. When she finally stepped back and admired her work, the students stared at the board with expressions that ranged from confusion to complete terror. She turned to face the class with her arms crossed and a slight smile on her face that suggested she knew exactly how intimidating this problem appeared to everyone in the room. The equation she had written was not just some random problem from a textbook, but something that had real importance for humanity's future, in ways that most of these students could not even begin to imagine. This was mathematics that would determine whether Earth would be accepted into the greater galactic community or left behind to struggle alone in the universe. Professor Carter began her explanation by pointing to different sections of the equation and describing what each part represented in terms of physics and spatial mathematics. She talked about dimensions that existed beyond the normal 3 that humans experienced every day, and about how space could be folded and manipulated if you understood the correct mathematical principles. Her voice was confident and clear as she explained concepts that had taken her decades to fully understand, and she expected her students to follow along even though she knew most of them were already lost. In the back corner of the lecture hall sat Marcus Webb, who was taking notes at a steady pace while his eyes moved between the board and his notebook. Marcus was only 16 years old, which made him by far the youngest person in this advanced mathematics class. He had enrolled at Ridgemont University 2 years earlier through a special program designed for students who showed exceptional abilities in mathematics and science. His test scores had been so high that the university had no choice but to accept him, even though he was still technically supposed to be in high school. Being so much younger than everyone else in his classes had taught Marcus to keep quiet and avoid drawing attention to himself whenever possible. He had learned early on that speaking up often led to skepticism and doubt from both professors and fellow students who seemed unable to believe that someone his age could truly understand the material at such an advanced level, so Marcus had developed a habit of sitting in the back and working through problems on his own while letting older students ask the questions and participate in discussions. As Professor Carter continued her lecture, Marcus found himself working through the equation in his notebook with increasing speed and confidence. The problem that she described as nearly impossible was beginning to make sense to him in ways that felt almost natural and intuitive. He could see patterns in the numbers and relationships between the variables that seemed to jump off the page and arrange themselves into a clear solution. His pencil moved faster as he worked through each step and double-checked his calculations to make sure he had not made any mistakes. Professor Carter was now telling the class about how this particular equation had stumped some of the brightest mathematical minds on Earth for the past 6 months. She mentioned her own doctoral student, Gregory Phillips, who had spent weeks trying to solve it, before finally admitting defeat and moving on to other research projects. The equation represented a test that had been given to humanity by advanced alien civilizations who wanted to see if Earth was intellectually capable of joining the Galactic Council. So far, every mathematician who had attempted to solve it had failed completely. The professor explained that Earth had made first contact with alien species 3 years ago, and the encounter had been both exciting and humbling for humanity. The aliens had been polite but firm in their assessment that Earth was far behind the rest of the galaxy in terms of scientific and mathematical development. They had given humanity 10 years to prove that the species was capable of intellectual advancement or face the possibility of being isolated from the galactic community forever. This equation was meant to be a simple benchmark test, but it had become a symbol of everything that Earth was struggling to achieve. Marcus stared down at his notebook where he had just completed what he believed was the full solution to the equation. He had approached the problem differently than what Professor Carter had described as the standard method. Instead of trying to solve each dimensional variable separately, Marcus had recognized that the dimensions were connected in a nested pattern that required simultaneous calculation. He had used techniques from fractal geometry that he had studied on his own to create a framework that allowed all the variables to be solved together rather than one at a time. The solution looked elegant and simple now that it was complete, which made Marcus even more confident that he had done it correctly. In mathematics, the most profound truths often appeared deceptively simple once you understood the underlying structure. He checked his work 3 more times, going through each step carefully and verifying every calculation. There were no errors that he could find, and the answer satisfied all the conditions that the equation required. Professor Carter was now asking if anyone in the class could even suggest where to begin with solving this problem. The room remained silent as students shifted uncomfortably in their seats and avoided making eye contact with her. She sighed deeply and shook her head as if disappointed but not surprised by the lack of response. She told the class that this was exactly why Earth was failing to meet the expectations of the galactic community and why humanity might never be accepted as an equal partner among the stars. Marcus felt his hand beginning to move toward the air, but he stopped himself before raising it completely. Speaking up now would mean becoming the center of attention and dealing with all the doubt and skepticism that usually came when he tried to contribute in class. He had experienced it so many times before, and each time it left him feeling frustrated and invisible. But this time was different because this time he had actually solved something important and something that could potentially help all of humanity take a step forward in the universe. Professor Carter was gathering her papers and preparing to leave when Marcus finally spoke up and told her that he believed he had solved the equation she had presented in class. His voice came out quieter than he had intended, and for a moment he worried that she might not have heard him over the sound of students talking in the hallway outside. But she stopped what she was doing and turned to look at him properly for the first time since he had approached her desk. Her eyes moved slowly from his worn sneakers up to his faded hoodie and finally settled on his young face with an expression that was hard to read. She asked him if he was actually enrolled in this class because she did not immediately recognize him from her mental roster of students. Marcus explained that yes, he was enrolled through the advanced placement program and gave his name as Marcus Webb. He could see the moment when recognition flickered across her features as she placed him among the sea of faces that filled her lecture hall twice a week. Her expression shifted into something that looked like a mixture of amusement, and pity which made Marcus's stomach tighten with worry about what was coming next. Professor Carter set down her eraser and leaned back against her desk, with her arms crossing over her chest in a posture that Marcus had learned to recognize as defensive and dismissive. She told Marcus that she appreciated his enthusiasm, but explained that this equation had defeated some of the most accomplished mathematicians on Earth, including people with decades of experience and multiple advanced degrees. Her own doctoral student Gregory, who had a master's degree from Cambridge and had published 4 papers in quantum mathematics, had been unable to solve it despite working on it for weeks. Marcus pulled the folded papers from his pocket and extended them toward her, while saying that he understood how unlikely it sounded, but he would really like her to look at his work anyway. The papers felt heavy in his hand, as if they carried the weight of everything he had accomplished and everything he was hoping would happen if someone would just give him a chance. But Professor Carter did not reach out to take the papers from him. Instead, she remained leaning against her desk with her arms still crossed and her expression growing more skeptical with each passing second. She asked Marcus how old he was, and when he told her 16, she repeated the number back to him as if testing how ridiculous it sounded. Then she said his age out loud, followed by a statement that summarized the situation in a way that made it clear she thought he was wasting her time. She asked him if he was really telling her that a 16-year-old undergraduate had solved a problem that stumped Earth's greatest mathematical minds in just one class period. The way she said it made the accomplishment sound impossible rather than impressive. Marcus tried to explain that he knew it sounded unlikely, but he had worked through each step carefully and checked his calculations multiple times. He attempted once again to hand her the papers, but she still would not take them. Instead, she held up one hand in a gesture that told him to stop and listen to what she was about to say. She began speaking in a tone that was not exactly cruel, but was firm enough that Marcus understood she was serious about what she was telling him. Professor Carter explained that she had been teaching mathematics for 20 years, and during that time, she had encountered countless bright young students who overestimated their own abilities. She said that mathematics at this level was not like high school algebra, where you could just work through problems using basic formulas and intuition. The kind of advanced quantum topology and spatial mathematics involved in this equation required years of intensive study and a depth of understanding that simply could not be acquired quickly, no matter how smart someone thought they were. Marcus felt heat rising in his face, and his hands were beginning to shake slightly from a combination of frustration and embarrassment. He insisted that he was not overestimating himself, and that if she would just look at his work, she would see that he had found the correct solution. But Professor Carter was already picking up her briefcase and clearly preparing to leave the lecture hall. She told Marcus in a voice that was meant to sound kind but came across as condescending that she did not have time to review incorrect solutions from every student who thought they had discovered the answer. She mentioned that her doctoral student Gregory alone had brought her 5 different attempted solutions over the past few months, and each one had represented weeks of intensive work and complex calculations. Each attempt had been wrong despite all the time and effort that had gone into creating them. The implication was clear that if someone as educated and experienced as Gregory could not solve it, then there was no way a 16-year-old undergraduate could have succeeded where he had failed. Marcus stated quietly but firmly that his solution was not wrong and that he was certain about his work. But Professor Carter was already walking past him toward the door of the lecture hall. She paused briefly before leaving and turned back to say one more thing to him. She suggested that perhaps this equation should serve as a humbling reminder that some problems required years of advanced study to even approach, much less solve. She encouraged him to use this experience as motivation to continue his education and focus on mastering the fundamental concepts before attempting such ambitious challenges. Then she offered what she clearly thought was helpful advice by telling Marcus that he was obviously bright to be in this program at his age, but warning him not to let overconfidence derail his academic career before it had truly begun. She repeated that he should focus on mastering the fundamentals, and that with time and dedication, he might eventually be capable of tackling problems at this level. Then she walked out of the lecture hall, leaving Marcus standing alone in the empty room with his folded papers still clutched in his hand. Marcus looked down at the papers that contained his solution and felt a wave of frustration. wash over him that was unlike anything he had experienced before. He knew with absolute certainty that his answer was correct. He could feel it in the same way he could feel his own heartbeat. The mathematics made sense and the solution satisfied every requirement that the equation demanded. But nobody would even look at it, because they had already decided, based on his age and probably other factors, that he could not possibly be smart enough to have accomplished what he claimed. He stood there, in the empty lecture hall, for several minutes just staring at his solution and trying to process what had just happened. The fluorescent lights continued their quiet buzzing overhead, and somewhere in the distance he could hear students laughing and talking as they moved between classes. But Marcus felt completely alone in that moment, more isolated than he had ever felt since arriving at Ridgemont University 2 years ago. He had finally done something truly significant, and nobody would believe him. The auditorium continued to buzz with noise and energy as people reacted to the Centaurian delegate's announcement that Marcus's solution was correct. Students were standing on their seats trying to get a better view, while faculty members turned to each other with expressions of complete disbelief. Media cameras that had been recording the event swiveled to focus on Marcus, who stood on stage feeling overwhelmed by the sudden attention. The 3 alien delegates were now conferring among themselves, and their voices blended together in a harmony of chimes and melody that was beautiful despite being completely foreign. One of the Andromedan delegates began making louder chiming, sounds that Marcus would later learn was the equivalent of enthusiastic applause in their culture. The crystalline being turned toward the audience and spoke in that wind chime voice, explaining that Marcus's solution was not merely correct, but actually elegant and sophisticated. The alien stated that the approach Marcus had used, involving nested dimensional recursion, was more advanced than the standard solution that was typically taught to their own students. This revelation sent another wave of excited whispers through the crowd. The Centaurian delegate held up Marcus's papers again, and the holographic display system above the stage suddenly activated, showing Marcus's handwritten equations magnified so that everyone in the auditorium could see them clearly. The delegate began walking the audience through the solution step by step, while his glowing finger traced paths through the air, following the logic that Marcus had laid out on the pages. He pointed out how Marcus had recognized what experienced mathematicians had missed, which was that the dimensions in the equation formed a dependent system rather than independent variables. The delegate explained that most people attempted to solve the dimensional variables separately, which inevitably led to infinite regress in unsolvable loops. But Marcus had understood intuitively that the dimensions needed to be solved simultaneously, through a process of recursive integration. The Centaurian's voice carried genuine admiration as he described how Marcus had adapted principles from fractal geometry to create a framework that allowed for simultaneous multidimensional calculation. This was not something that could be easily taught because it required a special kind of spatial reasoning that operated across multiple dimensions at once. Then the delegate highlighted a specific section of Marcus's work, and his glowing eyes brightened with what could only be described as delight. He pointed to a mathematical shortcut that Marcus had discovered, which simplified a particularly complex portion of the equation. The Centaurian stated that this shortcut was something he had never seen before in all his years of studying quantum mathematics. The second Andromedan delegate chimed in agreement, and added that this technique alone represented a minor breakthrough that could potentially simplify multiple equations in their own advanced research programs. University President Hamilton found her voice and asked Marcus directly if he had truly solved this equation during a single class lecture period. Marcus nodded, feeling his face grow warm under so much scrutiny, and confirmed that the pattern had simply made sense to him. As Professor Carter was explaining the problem, the words felt inadequate to describe the experience of watching the numbers arrange themselves in his mind, like pieces of a puzzle falling into their natural places. But he did not know how else to explain what had happened. The Centaurian turned his attention to Professor Carter, who still stood at the podium looking like she wished she could disappear. The delegate asked her in a gentle but firm tone if she had indeed presented this equation during her lecture 3 days earlier. Professor Carter managed to confirm that yes, she had presented it. Then the delegate asked if Marcus had approached her with his solution, and again her answer came out quiet and embarrassed, as she admitted that he had. The next question hung heavy in the air before it was even asked. The Centaurian stated rather than asked that Professor Carter had dismissed Marcus without reviewing his work. The way he phrased it made it clear that this was not really a question but an observation that everyone already knew was true. Professor Carter tried to explain that she had assumed the solution would be incorrect because Marcus was only 16 years old and even her doctoral student with all his education and experience had been unable to solve it. But her explanation sounded weak and hollow in the face of what had just been proven. The delegate's voice remained gentle, but there was unmistakable steel beneath it as he pointed out that Professor Carter had made an assumption based on Marcus's age. Then he added something that made the entire auditorium fall silent again. He suggested that perhaps there had been other factors as well beyond just age that had influenced her decision to dismiss Marcus without even looking at his work. The implication was clear and uncomfortable, and nobody wanted to voice it out loud, but everyone understood what the delegate was hinting at. Professor Carter's face had gone from red to pale, and she seemed unable to formulate any response that would make the situation better. The Centaurian did not press the point further, but instead turned his attention back to Marcus, with an expression that had softened considerably. He told Marcus that what he had accomplished was truly remarkable, and that it went far beyond simply solving a difficult equation. The delegate explained that the solution had required Marcus to see patterns across multiple dimensions simultaneously and to hold complex nested systems in his mind while recognizing symmetries that were not immediately obvious. These abilities were signs of what the galactic community called quantum mathematical cognition, which was a rare gift that appeared in only a small percentage of individuals across all species. It was not something that could be taught through education or practice because you either possessed this particular type of intuition or you did not. The Centaurian explained that in their civilization, those who demonstrated this gift were highly valued and given special training to develop their abilities to the fullest extent possible. They had entire universities dedicated to nurturing such talents. The Andromedan delegate chimed in to add that the Galactic Council operated an academy specifically for gifted mathematicians from across the entire galaxy. Students from hundreds of different worlds studied together, learning from each other and from the most accomplished teachers that galactic civilization had to offer. The academy was located on Proxima Station, which orbited a star many light years from Earth. Then the Centaurian asked Marcus a question that made his heart skip several beats. The delegate asked if Marcus would be interested in joining the other students at the Quantum Academy. He explained that Marcus would be the first human ever to attend and that he would receive training that would help him develop his natural abilities far beyond what Earth's educational system could currently provide. For a moment, Marcus could not process what he was being asked because the opportunity seemed too enormous to be real. He managed to stammer out a question, asking if the delegate was serious about this offer. The Centaurian smiled in a way that looked almost human, despite his silver skin and glowing eyes. He confirmed that yes, he was completely serious and that the council would be honored to have Marcus join their academy. Marcus felt tears pricking at his eyes as emotions overwhelmed him, and he said yes. Then he said it again more firmly and clearly, so there could be no doubt. Yes, he would absolutely love to attend the Quantum Academy. The auditorium erupted once more, but this time it was with genuine celebration rather than shock. Marcus felt his heart pounding so hard in his chest that he worried everyone around him could hear it as he sat in the crowded auditorium listening to the Centaurian delegate essentially pronounce judgment on humanity's intellectual capabilities. The folded papers containing his solution had been in his jacket pocket for 3 days now, because he had been carrying them everywhere, hoping for some kind of opportunity to share them with someone who might actually listen. He had brought them today, not really expecting to use them, but unable to leave them behind because they had become almost like a talisman. Now, as he listened to the delegates explaining that Earth might have reached an intellectual ceiling that could never be overcome, Marcus realized that this was his moment. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for, even though it terrified him more than anything he had ever done in his life. Speaking up now meant standing in front of hundreds of people and aliens who were literally judging humanity's worth. It meant risking public humiliation if he was somehow wrong about his solution. It meant becoming the center of attention in a way that he had spent his entire university career trying to avoid, but the alternative was to sit in silence and let the delegates leave Believing that humanity was incapable of solving their test, Marcus knew that his solution was correct with a certainty that went beyond mere confidence. He had checked and rechecked his work so many times that every step was burned into his memory. The mathematics was sound and elegant and beautiful, in the way that true solutions always were. If he did not speak up now, then he would be allowing humanity to be judged unfairly, based on incomplete information. Marcus stood up before he could talk, himself out of it, and his movement caught the attention of students sitting near him in his section of the auditorium. Heads turned and people stared as this young person rose from his seat while everyone else remained frozen. Tyler, who was sitting next to him, looked over with wide eyes that seemed to communicate both encouragement and concern. Marcus could see his friend silently asking if he was sure about what he was about to do, but also urging him to go through with it. The words came out of Marcus's mouth quieter than he had hoped, and for a terrible moment he thought nobody had heard him over the low murmur of conversation that filled the auditorium. But then the people nearest to him fell silent, and that silence spread outward like ripples on water until the entire massive room was quiet. He tried again, speaking louder this time, and said that he had a solution to the equation. The auditorium erupted in whispers and gasps as hundreds of people processed what this young student had just claimed. Professor Carter saw him, standing there, and her face went through a rapid series of expressions, starting with surprise, then moving to recognition, and finally settling on something that looked like anger, mixed with embarrassment. She said his name sharply and told him that this was not the appropriate time for disruptions. But Marcus had committed now, and there was no turning back. He spoke over her and stated clearly that he had solved the benchmark equation 6 months ago during her lecture 3 days earlier. He added that he had tried to show her his work, but she had refused to look at it. The whispers in the auditorium grew louder as people reacted to this revelation. Professor Carter's face flushed red, and she opened her mouth to say something that was probably going to be harsh. But before she could speak, the Centaurian delegate raised one silver hand in a gesture that commanded immediate silence. His glowing blue eyes focused on Marcus with an intensity that made it feel like he was looking directly into Marcus's soul. The alien stood slowly, and his presence seemed to fill the entire stage. Despite his relatively human-sized frame, the Centaurian asked Marcus his name in that melodic voice that somehow carried to every corner of the auditorium without seeming loud. Marcus answered that his name was Marcus Webb, and tried to keep his voice steady despite his nervousness. The delegate then asked how old Marcus was, and when Marcus replied that he was 16, a fresh wave of surprised murmurs swept through the crowd. People around him were whispering to each other, clearly shocked that someone so young was claiming to have solved what Earth's greatest minds could not. The delegate's glowing eyes seemed to brighten slightly, which Marcus somehow understood was a sign of interest or curiosity. The alien asked if Marcus truly claimed to have solved the benchmark equation that the council had provided. Marcus pulled the worn and folded papers from his jacket pocket and held them up for everyone to see. He confirmed that yes, he had the solution right here, and that he had completed it during a single lecture period. The papers trembled slightly in his hand, but his voice remained clear as he spoke. Professor Carter tried to intervene again, telling Marcus not to embarrass himself in front of the entire university and the galactic delegates, but the Centaurian raised his hand again to silence her, and this time there was something firmer in his gesture that made it clear he would not tolerate any more interruptions. He looked back at Marcus and requested that he bring his solution forward to the stage. The walk down the auditorium aisle toward the stage felt like it took forever, even though it was probably only 30 seconds. Marcus climbed the stairs to the stage with his legs, feeling shaky and uncertain beneath him. Every eye in the auditorium was focused on him, and he could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. He was acutely aware of how young he must look standing there on stage next to the alien delegates and university officials. The stage lights were bright and hot, making him squint slightly as he approached the Centaurian delegate, who extended one silver hand to receive the papers. Marcus placed his solution into the delegate's hand and watched as those glowing blue eyes began scanning the pages. The two Andromedan delegates leaned in close, and their crystalline bodies made soft chiming sounds as they moved. The Centaurian unfolded each page carefully and methodically, working through Marcus's handwritten equations and explanations. The auditorium remained completely silent as hundreds of people waited to see what the aliens would say about this unexpected development. Time seemed to stretch and slow as the delegates reviewed Marcus's work together. Then, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes, the Centaurian delegate looked up from the pages. His expression had transformed into something that Marcus could only describe as joy, even though the alien features were so different from human ones. The delegate's glowing eyes were brighter now, almost blazing with blue light. He turned to face the auditorium and held up Marcus's papers so everyone could see them. Then he spoke 3 words that would change Marcus's life and possibly the future of humanity forever. The Centaurian announced in a clear voice that carried throughout the entire auditorium that the solution was correct. For a moment there was absolute silence as people processed what they had just heard. Then the auditorium exploded into chaos with voices overlapping in shock and disbelief and excitement. People jumped to their feet trying to see better while others pulled out phones to record this historic moment. Professor Carter stood frozen at the podium with her mouth open and no sound coming out. Marcus walked across the university campus with his backpack weighing heavily on his shoulders, though the physical weight was nothing compared to the heaviness in his mind after what had just happened with Professor Carter. The autumn afternoon was crisp and golden with leaves falling from trees and students scattered across the quad, enjoying the pleasant weather between classes. Groups of friends walked together laughing and chatting while Marcus walked alone as he usually did, feeling like an outsider in a world that had never quite made space for him. Being 16 years old at a university filled with people in their 20s and 30s was isolating in ways that Marcus had not fully anticipated when he first enrolled. Most students treated him politely but kept their distance as if they were unsure how to relate to someone so much younger. He did not get invited to study groups or social events, and his attempts to join conversations often resulted in awkward silences or patronizing responses. Add to that the fact that he was one of only a handful of black students in the advanced mathematics program, and Marcus sometimes felt like he was living in a completely different world from everyone around him. But mathematics had always been his refuge and his sanctuary, because numbers did not care about age or skin color or anyone's expectations about who was supposed to be smart. In mathematics, there was objective truth that could not be argued with or dismissed based on superficial judgments. 2 + 2 = 4, whether you were 16 or 60, whether you were black or white, whether you came from wealth or poverty. Marcus loved that purity and that fairness, which was why being dismissed by Professor Carter hurt so deeply, because she had rejected his mathematical proof. Without even looking at it, he found his usual spot in the university library, tucked away in a quiet corner of the mathematics section, surrounded by tall shelves packed with journals and reference books. This corner desk had become his home base on campus, where he spent most of his free time working through problems and exploring mathematical concepts that went far beyond what was covered in his classes. Here at least he could focus entirely on the beauty of numbers and patterns without having to navigate the complicated social dynamics that made the rest of university life so challenging. Marcus pulled out his solution once again and spread the pages across the desk so he could review his work for what must have been the 100th time since completing it. The equation that Professor Carter had presented involved calculating stable pathways through folded space and time, which was the theoretical foundation for faster-than-light travel. Most mathematicians approached this problem by trying to solve each dimensional variable separately and then combining the results. But Marcus had immediately recognized that this linear approach would never work, because the dimensions were not truly independent of each other. The breakthrough had come when Marcus realized that the dimensional variables formed a nested system, where each dimension influenced all the others in a cascading pattern. This meant they had to be solved simultaneously rather than sequentially. He had used techniques from fractal geometry that he had taught himself by reading advanced textbooks to create a framework that allowed all the variables to be calculated together. The solution was elegant and surprisingly simple once you understood the underlying structure, which was exactly how the most profound mathematical truths always appeared. Marcus heard footsteps approaching and looked up to see his roommate Tyler Chen, who was carrying Marcus's folded solution papers that must have fallen from his backpack somewhere along the way. Tyler dropped into the chair across from Marcus and handed over the papers with a friendly grin. Tyler was one of the few people at Ridgemont who had treated Marcus as an equal from the very first day they met. He was a computer science major who did not care about age or background or any of the superficial things that seemed to matter so much to other students. Tyler asked what was wrong because Marcus apparently looked like Someone had just stolen his lunch money. Marcus hesitated for a moment before explaining everything about the equation and his solution, and Professor Carter's refusal to even look at his work. Tyler listened with growing disbelief as the story unfolded. When Marcus finished explaining, Tyler leaned forward excitedly and pointed out that this was the impossible equation that had been all over the news for months. This was the alien mathematics problem that Earth's greatest minds had been struggling to solve. Marcus confirmed that yes, he had solved that equation, and yes, he was pretty confident that his solution was correct. Tyler's excitement grew even more intense as he realized the magnitude of what Marcus had accomplished. He said this was huge, and that if Marcus had actually solved it, then it could change everything for humanity's relationship with the galactic community. But Marcus interrupted him to explain that none of that mattered, because nobody would even look at his work. Professor Carter had dismissed him without giving his solution a single glance. Tyler's enthusiasm dimmed as he processed this information and asked if Professor Carter had refused to look because Marcus was 16. Marcus shrugged uncomfortably and said maybe that was part of it, but probably not the only reason. He did not want to voice the other possibility that was gnawing at him, but Tyler seemed to understand anyway. Tyler asked quietly if Marcus thought there was more to the dismissal than just his age. Marcus explained that he had noticed patterns since starting at Ridgemont University that suggested some professors and students did not take him as seriously as they should. He described how some professors rarely called on him even when he was the only student with his hand raised. He talked about how other students seemed genuinely surprised when he performed well on exams, as if they had expected him to fail. He mentioned the study groups that somehow always formed without anyone thinking to invite him. Tyler listened with a troubled expression and said that was really messed up. Marcus agreed but added that it was just the way things were, and he had learned to deal with it over the past 2 years. But this situation was different, Marcus explained, because now he had actually accomplished something genuinely important that could help all of humanity move forward in the universe. He had solved a problem that could prove Earth was intellectually capable of joining the galactic community. Yet nobody would even look at his solution because they had already decided, based on who he was rather than what he had done, that he could not possibly be smart enough. The frustration in his voice was obvious as he spoke, and Tyler could see how much this rejection had hurt his friend. Tyler sat back in his chair thinking for a moment before asking what Marcus planned to do next. Marcus did not have an answer to that question because he honestly did not know how to make anyone take him seriously. He could not force Professor Carter to look at his work, and he did not know who else might be willing to review it. The solution sat on the desk between them, representing both his greatest achievement and his greatest frustration all at once. 3 days after his conversation with Tyler, the entire Ridgemont University campus erupted with activity and excitement because a delegation from the Galactic Council was arriving for an official inspection tour. The announcement had been made 2 weeks earlier, giving everyone time to prepare, but now that the day had actually arrived, there was a sense of nervous energy that filled every corner of the campus. Students and faculty rushed around making final preparations, while security personnel established perimeters and media crews set up their equipment to capture this historic moment. Marcus watched from his dormitory window as the alien spacecraft descended toward the main quadrangle in the center of campus. The ship was unlike anything built by human hands, with a sleek design that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The vessel moved silently through the air, defying everything humans thought they understood about physics and aerodynamics. When it finally settled onto the grass without leaving any marks or disturbing the ground around it, Marcus felt a sense of awe at the casual display of technology that Earth could not even begin to replicate. 3 figures emerged from the ship, moving with grace and purpose as they stepped onto Earth soil. 2 of them were Andromedans who stood tall with bodies that appeared to be made of living crystal that refracted light into rainbow patterns. Their forms seemed to shift and shimmer as they moved, creating an almost hypnotic effect. The 3rd alien was a Centaurian who looked more humanoid but had silver skin that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight and eyes that glowed with a soft blue luminescence. All 3 wore flowing garments that seemed to move independently of any breeze. The university had been preparing for this visit for weeks, and everyone understood that this was both an honor and a test of Earth's worthiness. If Ridgemont could impress the delegation, then it might secure additional resources and access to alien technology that would benefit all of humanity. But if the university disappointed the visitors, then it would confirm what many in the galaxy already believed, which was that humans were intellectually inferior and unworthy of joining the galactic community as equals. Professor Carter had been chosen to represent the mathematics department and present humanities. Progress to the delegation. Marcus had heard through campus gossip that she had been working day and night on her presentation for the past 2 weeks. She was going to showcase the work of her most accomplished students and colleagues in an attempt to demonstrate that Earth was making steady progress, even if that progress was slower than what the aliens might prefer. The entire future of human and alien relations might depend on how well she could convince them that humanity deserved patience and support. That afternoon, Marcus joined hundreds of other students and faculty members who packed into the university's grand auditorium to witness the public portion of the delegation's visit. The 3 aliens sat on stage beside University President Linda Hamilton, looking patient and attentive as various presentations unfolded over the course of 2 hours. Speakers from different departments described research, projects, and academic achievements while trying their best to make Earth's accomplishments sound impressive to beings who came from civilizations thousands of years more advanced. Professor Carter's turn came after numerous other presentations had already been delivered. She walked to the podium with confidence and activated a holographic display system that filled the air above the stage with swirling mathematical formulas and 3-dimensional graphs. She began her presentation by thanking the delegates for their visit and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to demonstrate Earth's commitment to mathematical advancement. Then she launched into a detailed description of various research projects that her department had been working on over the past year. Marcus watched as Professor Carter highlighted breakthroughs in theoretical frameworks and computational models that her students and colleagues had achieved. Her presentation was polished and professional, filled with impressive-sounding terminology and complex visualizations. But Marcus could not help noticing that the Andromedan delegates did not seem particularly impressed by anything they were seeing. Their crystalline bodies remained still, and their expressions, which were difficult to read on such alien features, seemed to convey something closer to disappointment than admiration. Professor Carter concluded her presentation by addressing the benchmark equation directly, which was the test that the Galactic Council had given to Earth 6 months earlier. She explained that her department was continuing to make steady progress on the problem, and that her doctoral student Gregory Phillips had developed several promising approaches. She predicted with confidence that they would arrive at a complete solution within the next 3 to 6 months. The auditorium remained quiet as she finished speaking and returned to her seat on the stage, looking satisfied with her performance. Then the Centaurian delegate leaned forward in his chair, and his glowing blue eyes fixed on Professor Carter with an intensity that made everyone in the auditorium hold their breath. When he spoke, his voice had a melodic quality that came from learning English as a foreign language, but mastering every nuance and subtlety. He thanked Professor Carter for her thorough presentation, but then expressed concern about what he had heard. The benchmark equation that Earth had been given 6 months ago was considered a basic proficiency test in galactic educational systems. Students at the undergraduate level typically solved it in 2 to 3 hours. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the auditorium as people processed what the delegate had just said. Earth had been working on this problem for over 4,000 hours, while alien students completed it in less than 3. The Centaurian continued speaking and explained that Earth's inability to solve this relatively simple problem suggested a fundamental gap in mathematical reasoning that troubled the Council greatly. The delegates had come to Ridgemont hoping to see evidence that humanity was capable of catching up to galactic standards, but instead they were seeing confirmation of their worst fears. Professor Carter tried to salvage the situation by suggesting that perhaps the complexity of the equation had been underestimated. But one of the Andromedan delegates interrupted her with a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The alien stated firmly that the equation was not complex by galactic standards, but was actually quite foundational. The fact that Earth's brightest minds could not solve it indicated that humanity might not be capable of the intellectual advancement necessary for Council membership. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for humanity's galactic ambitions. University. President Hamilton stood up quickly and tried to redirect the conversation. by asking if the delegates could provide guidance on how Earth might improve its approach. But the Centaurian responded with gentle firmness that the approach was not the real issue. What concerned them was the intellectual capacity itself, because they had observed similar patterns across multiple species throughout galactic history. Some civilizations reached a mathematical ceiling beyond which they simply could not advance no matter how hard they tried. The delegates' words suggested that Earth might have already reached that ceiling, which would mean humanity's fate was sealed. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day in the auditorium, and Marcus now stood on the observation deck of Proxima Station, gazing out at a nebula that painted the darkness of space in breathtaking shades of purple and gold. The view never got old, no matter how many times he came here to think and reflect on how dramatically his life had changed. Behind him stretched the main campus of the Quantum Academy, which consisted of 3 massive connected habitats that housed over 2,000 students from 87 different alien species. Each habitat was designed to accommodate the various environmental needs of species that had evolved under completely different conditions. Marcus had arrived at the academy 3 months ago, feeling nervous and uncertain, despite all the encouragement he had received from the Centaurian delegate, whose name he had learned was Valen. Those first few days had been overwhelming, as Marcus tried to navigate a campus where most students were not even humanoid, and where the basic assumptions about physics and mathematics that he had grown up with were constantly being challenged and expanded. But something remarkable had happened almost immediately, which was that for the first time in his entire life, Marcus felt like he truly belonged somewhere. Here at the academy, his age was completely irrelevant, because students ranged from the equivalent of 12 years old to over 100, depending on their species and their individual developmental rates. His human appearance did not matter, because everyone looked different from everyone else, and diversity was not just accepted, but celebrated as essential to the learning process. The only thing that mattered to anyone was the quality of his mathematical thinking and his willingness to share ideas and learn from others. Marcus had finally found a place where he could simply be himself, without constantly navigating other people's preconceptions. His roommate was a being named Kyle, who came from the Proxima system and whose species processed mathematical concepts through auditory patterns rather than visual symbols. Learning to communicate with Kyle had been challenging at first, but also incredibly rewarding, because it forced Marcus to think about mathematics in completely new ways. Kyle could solve differential equations by listening to harmonic progressions, while Marcus worked through the same problems using written notation. Teaching each other their different approaches had opened up new dimensions of understanding that neither of them could have accessed alone. Marcus had made several other close friends during his time at the academy, including a Centaurian student named Lyra, who could manipulate holographic spheres while solving equations, and an Andromedan named Crystallis, whose crystalline body literally sang mathematical proofs through vibrations and harmonics. The 3 of them often studied together, and their different perspectives created a synergy that helped all of them advance faster than they would have individually. Marcus had never experienced this kind of collaborative learning environment on Earth, where competition often overshadowed cooperation. The courses at the academy were more challenging than anything Marcus had encountered at Ridgemont University, but they were also infinitely more exciting. He was learning mathematical frameworks that would not be discovered on Earth for centuries if humans were left to develop on their own. His professors were beings who had spent lifetimes mastering concepts that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with pure thought and logic. They taught him techniques for visualizing problems in higher dimensions and methods for holding multiple complex systems in his mind simultaneously. But perhaps the most valuable thing Marcus had gained at the academy was confidence in his own abilities and the freedom to push those abilities to their absolute limits. Back on Earth, he had always held himself back, worried about drawing too much attention or making others uncomfortable with his intelligence. Here he could work at full capacity and challenge himself in ways that felt almost transcendent. The quantum mathematical cognition that the delegates had identified in him was being developed and refined through careful training and practice. Marcus had also discovered that his unique perspective as a human brought valuable insights to problems that his alien classmates approached from their own cultural and biological frameworks. The shortcut he had found in the benchmark equation had already been incorporated into standard academy curriculum. Just last week, one of his professors had asked him to present his approach to solving hyperspace navigation equations at the monthly symposium attended by mathematicians from across the galaxy. The presentation had gone well, and afterward, several researchers had approached him about collaborating on advanced projects. News of Marcus's success had reached Earth and made him something of a celebrity back home. Media outlets had covered his story extensively with headlines praising his genius, while also questioning how the educational system had almost overlooked such exceptional talent. The coverage had sparked important conversations about bias and assumptions in academic settings. Universities across the planet were now re-evaluating their approaches to identifying and nurturing gifted students regardless of age or background, or any other superficial characteristics. Professor Carter had quietly resigned from Ridgemont University shortly after the incident with the galactic delegates. Marcus had heard through Tyler that she had left citing personal reasons, but everyone understood the real motivation behind her departure. Marcus did not take any satisfaction in her resignation because he understood that she had been shaped by a system that valued credentials over capabilities. The real problem was not any individual professor, but rather the structures and assumptions that allowed bias to flourish unchecked. Ridgemont had established a new program specifically designed to identify and support gifted students from all backgrounds with full scholarships and intensive mentorship opportunities. Tyler had written to tell Marcus that they had named it the Marcus Webb Initiative, which made Marcus feel both proud and slightly embarrassed, but he was glad that his experience might help open doors for other young people who had brilliant minds but lacked the traditional markers that universities typically looked for. Marcus's parents called him every week through the quantum communication system that connected Earth to Proxima Station. His mother still cried sometimes when he showed her the view from the observation deck or introduced her to his alien friends through the video feed. His father, who taught mathematics at a high school back home, constantly asked detailed questions about teaching methods at the academy. He was already thinking about how to adapt some of these techniques for his own students, and Marcus loved helping him understand the principles behind galactic educational approaches. The communication device that Marcus wore on his wrist chimed softly, indicating an incoming message. He looked down to see that it was from the Galactic Council's Earth Liaison Office. They were asking if he would be interested in returning to Earth next summer to teach a masterclass in quantum mathematics to promising young students. The program was being called Inspiring the Next Generation, and they wanted Marcus to be the primary instructor. He smiled as he read the message and immediately accepted the invitation. Marcus looked back out at the nebula and thought about how far he had come from that lecture hall where Professor Carter had dismissed him without even glancing at his work. He thought about all the moments of doubt and frustration, when he had wondered if anyone would ever see past his age and really recognize what he was capable of achieving. Now he stood on an alien space station studying mathematics that most humans could not even imagine while representing his entire species to the galactic community. But more than his personal success, Marcus was proud that his story had helped begin changing how Earth approached education and talent development. He had become a symbol of potential that could be found in unexpected places if people were willing to look past their preconceptions. Every message he received from young students back on Earth who had been inspired by his journey reinforced his commitment to using his position as a bridge between humanity and the galaxy to help others follow in his footsteps. In the reflection of the observation window, Marcus could see his own face looking back at him. He still looked young because he was young, but there was a confidence in his expression that had not been there 6 months ago. He had proven to himself and to the galaxy that intelligence and genius could not be judged by superficial characteristics. He had shown that brilliance deserved to be recognized and nurtured regardless of where it appeared or what form it took. Behind Marcus, the door to the observation deck opened, and Cale called out that their advanced topology study group was starting in 10 minutes. Marcus took one last look at the nebula, appreciating its beauty and the reminder it provided of how vast and full of possibilities the universe truly was. Then he turned away from the window and headed back into the academy where equations awaited. His attention and friends waited to collaborate on solving problems that would shape the future. The galaxy had opened its doors to humanity in large part because Marcus had proven that Earth had the intellectual capacity to to deserve that opportunity. Now it was his responsibility, and his privilege, to help ensure that those doors stayed open, and that other brilliant minds would have chances to develop their potential.